I remember when I became a Christian, and we didn't know much about apologetics in 1965. Nobody was even talking about apologetics. So if you look at the literature, you will realize that the concept of apologetics in the 20th century does not really begin until probably with Francis Schaeffer in the late 60s and then into the 70s. Now, I'm not saying that he talked about apologetics only, and of course there were apologists. In 1948, there was a major book that was written, but nobody really paid much attention to it. And Edward J. Carnell, Testing Christianity's Truth Claims. Nobody paid much attention to it. But for some reason, when Schaeffer started doing apologetics, and you know his first book was The God Who Is There. It didn't come out first. Escape from Reason came out first, but then The God Who Is There, which was a series of lectures that he gave at Wheaton College in 1965. And that's what sort of put Schaeffer on the map in terms of, at least in America. And then after that, people started talking about apologetics. And by the time you get to the 1980s, why there's a growing body of literature, people are writing about apologetics, but it has not always been the case. As I was saying, when I became a Christian, we weren't dealing with some of the big issues. 65, we are only, 20 years from the end of World War II, and then there was the Korean conflict, and still people are pretty much theistic in their thinking, at least in the Western world, particularly in the United States. So nobody was thinking much about that. But as time went on, then we began to realize just how things were beginning to develop. So the intellectual climate in that sense, probably like the 1980s, it has been controlled by naturalism in the age of technology. And it is through technology that ideas have quickly spread, whereas prior to this, ideas spread only through the written page. There really wasn't any other way. But you get the World Wide Web is like 1996, something like that. It's in that bracelet. So when you get the age of technology, and I'm speaking now of image technology, social media technology, or you get the World Wide Web, now all of a sudden ideas are really traveling fast. They aren't traveling along geographical boundaries. They're traveling over geographical boundaries. And what you might post wherever you live, it could be read within minutes in another place of the world, thousands of miles away. But it is the fact that it is during the 80s that we begin to see the people promoting naturalism. That is, there's a decreasing interest in theism. There's a decreasing interest in, as Schaeffer's book was, The God Who Is There. There's just not that kind of interest anymore. And so we watched this fade. I watched it in my lifetime. When I became a Christian, many people would have affirmed there is a God. Many people would have affirmed that there's a judgment day. And people would really have known who Jesus Christ was. Now, they might not have believed him, might not have trusted him as their Savior and all of that. But if you would have said Jesus Christ, they would have made the identification with Christianity and God's Son. They might have just left it at that, but that would have been true. Athenagoras in the 2nd century, he makes a defense for Christianity, argued for Christians on the basis of their lifestyle. If you read his treatise that's given to the emperor, the Roman emperor, it's called A Plea for Christians, and Athenagoras points again and again and again. He talks about their married life, that they're faithful to their partner. He talks about they were anti-abortion. He said, we do not believe in abortion. We do not believe in we aren't rebels. We aren't rebels against the government. We're good citizens. And this was the fact of their lifestyle that confounded some of the political people in the day, because they were being asked, now you need to calm these Christians down. And then some of the local government officials were writing and saying, but you know, what can we say against them? They're really good people. They walk the line, so to speak. They have nice lives. They're pure lives. They're concerned about one another, etc., etc. So early on in the first, and this has been the second century, it was quite clear that Christians lived differently than anybody else. They lived against the culture. And so if a baby was born and she was a female, it could be the practice of simply throwing her on the trash heap. And Christians would go and rescue and adopt. No, nobody told them to do that. There wasn't an organization that said, now, you need to rescue the born and the discarded. You need to rescue them. No, they just were motivated by their faith and their faith in Christ. It was a true counterculture based on their beliefs grounded in Christ. It was rather straightforward in a sense, but certainly not easy. So we talk about mounting the stake. This is a phrase that came out of the UK with Kramer and others who had to go to the stake. So to mount the stake is I'm willing to serve Christ, live the Christ life, even if it means I'm going to be burned at the stake. Now that's a pretty easy thing to say. It's quite another thing to be actually willing. Most of us have not had to go to that step. But this is the kind of Christianity that the world knew. I think our age is more complicated. When I would teach students and about their being influenced by their culture, they say, but you were influenced by your culture too. Yes, but I had to tell you, the culture that influenced me in the 60s and the 70s had a strong theistic orientation to it. So when I became a Christian in 65, though I grew up in a non-Christian home for the first 12 years of my life, I knew no Christians until my dad became a believer. There absolutely was no Christian witness within 30 miles of my home in any direction. So I had no contact with Christianity when I was growing up in the United States, in the state of Maine. And yet, even though my father was not a Christian and had some habits that weren't Christian, my father would not tolerate lying. And interestingly enough, he would not work on Sunday. We lived on a farm. Now, we had to go out and milk the cows and all that, but my father would never have thought of mowing hay, or mowing the grass to make hay on a Friday or a Saturday, which would mean you'd have to do the haying on Sunday. They would never have thought of doing that. So my brother and I, who was 3 years my elder, we always loved Sunday because Sunday meant you didn't have to work. You just had to do the regular chores, but, this is great. We get mornings off and afternoons off, and we can play what we call catch, and we can play baseball or whatever. And so when I became a Christian, there wasn't the kind of deep-seated conflict that I had to go through. Now, at that time, you must realize that I was living at a time in the late 60s and 70s of the revolution, the sexual revolution and all that, but I wasn't touched by it. I live in a very small community in the state of Maine. But your age, or our age right now, I got, my shelf life is running out, but your age that you're living in is pretty complicated. Look at all the issues that we're being faced by the church. We would never, couldn't have dreamed in our wildest imagination that there would be anything like transgenderism or transhumanism, or that there would be certain lifestyles that would be accepted and fighting for space in in society. We just would not have known anything about those things. Lewis writes, that would be C.S. The difficulty we're up against is this: we can often make people attend to the Christian point of view for half an hour or so, but the moment they have gone away from the lecture or laid down our article, they are plunged back into the world where the opposite position is taken for granted. Every newspaper, film, novel, and textbook undermines our work. As long as that situation exists, widespread success simply is impossible. Now, that's true. And even more so today. So even when you find people who come to a conference, or they come to an evangelistic meeting, or even if they go to church, the fact of the matter is the power of the culture in which we live militates right against that. And unless we are very vigilant, we're overcome by it. A good sermon is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for a Christian culture. So what are we called to? Well, I would say we are called to be unstained by the world. That is, a godly lifestyle. Now, sometimes when we talk about that, people think we're talking about legalism, and that is just naivete. But it's worse than naivete. It's absolutely wrong. Legalism is when you do something to earn your salvation. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a lifestyle that comes out of our salvation. Don't we think there are some things we should not do? Don't we think there are some things we should not say? There are some places we should not go. And that's not legalism. That's just living differently than the world. The James 1:27, and also we are called to a renewed or a reordered minds. This is what I'd call godly discernment. You know, the well-known text in Romans 12, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed to the renewing of your minds, that by testing you may discern what is that will of God, which is good and acceptable and perfect. So there's the godly lifestyle, but if the godly lifestyle is just following a pattern, then of course it could become more legalistic. But what we're looking for is the mind that's renewed, or I would say reordered, and because we have reordered minds, we live differently. Immorality today results not from ignorance, but from weakness. If we do wrong, it's not because we don't know what it is. It's because of weakness. Lack of godly discernment results not from weakness, but from theological illiteracy. Many of the people in our churches are really almost theologically illiterate. I don't know who we blame, but the pastors. Theological illiteracy leads to a weightless Christian culture. All we are simply doing is we carry our Bibles to church, and that's about the only distinctive that the world or our communities ever see with us. Oh, they go to church on Sunday, and that's the only thing that marks us from the world. But it should be clearly, or surely, it seems to me, should be much more than that. The Christian culture points to something beyond itself. In that sense, it's what we call sacramental. Okay? There is a sacramental notion to the creation in which we live. Why? Because it points to something beyond itself. And in that way, it is also true that a Christian culture is sacramental in that if it's done properly, it points to beyond itself. I just simply say it's not salvific. Often when you say sacrament, you think, oh, must be the Catholic Church, and you're doing something to earn your salvation. That's not the way we use the word here as sacramental. Jacques Ellul said, the first Christians gained converts not because of their arguments were better than those of the pagan, but because people saw in them, in their community, something good and beautiful, and they wanted it. This led them to the truth. Now, arguments are good. I'm an apologist, philosopher, but I do apologetics. And I think arguments are good. But the case I want to make today is that when I say lifestyle, I'm not just talking about the lifestyle of the individual Christian. What amazes me when we read of the early documents of the church and people give testimony, they generally say it was Christians that caught their attention, not just one Christian. It was the group. There was a unity. There was a unity of purpose. There was a unity of lifestyle, which we don't see so much today. There's a lot of division within our churches, and even within a church that subscribes to the same theological position and roughly the same vision for the church, there's still on the cultural side a lack of support. I've had people come to me and say, listen, we have 2 daughters, and we're trying to train our daughters how to dress with modesty. But when we go to our church, we see other young ladies who are dressed rather immodestly. So you see, now there's the lack of support that says, now you're kind of almost fighting against the culture of the church. So you have the culture of the family, and then when it goes to the church, there seems to be some kind of discrepancy. I don't know how many of you have read anything of Jacques Ellul, but yes. Okay, good. He did a lot of work in technology, but this comes from the presence of the kingdom. He's not saying that arguments aren't good. He's just saying what really catches our attention, and I will say something about that a little bit later, and then I'll know who says it. The Christian culture is called to be attractive for the world. But how could it be attractive for the world when it looks so much like the world? Well, I think you can answer that question for yourself. Jesus said, by this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. But we live in, at least in America, in a very competitive, individualistic age where we're all trying to outdo the other person with our programs, with our big churches, and etc. Now, this is what I was going to say. Richard Weaver notes, now Richard Weaver was an English professor at the Chicago University. He writes this, by the way, in 1948 in a seminal work called Ideas Have Consequences, which many people have borrowed that phrase thereafter. He says, we do not undertake to reason about anything until we have been drawn to it by an effective interest. That's a really pretty important thing. So it's the church living in its the godliness and the reordered mind that gives something for the world to see that draws them because it's first effective. That is, it's first something that you desire. It's not an argument that's put upon you. Now, arguments may have to come. Don't misunderstand me. But Weaver's point is, people aren't going to reason about something if they aren't drawn to it effectively. And so you find as you go and talk to people, you witness, and you say to them, you start talking to them about the Christian, and how many times have you heard somebody say, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. I know so-and-so. I know the church down the road. You see that we have not lived in a way that people are effectively drawn to the Christian message, so they're not even open to reason about it. We must attend to creating the proper sentiments, and we do this by how we live. There's a whole great development that I work on, this idea of creating proper sentiments, proper desires, if you please. Humanity is drawn to the true, to the good, and the beautiful because that's for what we were created. We were not created for the grave. We were created for the garden. Genesis 3 tells us where the grave came in. But if you look at creation in Genesis 1 and 2, that's what we were created for. And I suspect that that's what we're going to return to. I think that's what Christ has done. He has redeemed not only us, He has redeemed the material world. And one day we will be back in the garden, so to speak. And probably, as some people think, that we'll be kind of floating around on a carpet, playing a harp, and not dressed very properly. But we won't look quite like ourselves. We'll look kind of like, what we think, a cherubim, which, or for some reason, they always think that's what a baby looks like. Or a baby is what the cherubim looks like. I think we'll live in the world as Adam and Eve were designed and headed for a while, and that's part of what our redemption is. And the reason that we're drawn to the true, the good, and the beautiful is because that's what we were created for. I know sin has come, it's corrupted, it's marred the image, but there's still underneath it all, there is this attraction to the true, the good, and the beautiful. That much was made of that in the Middle Ages within Christianity. Not much is made of it today. But I think it's a very important part of having a Christian community that reflects the true, the good, and the beautiful. Thomas Aquinas said that those three hold together. If it's true, it will be beautiful and it will be good. If it's good, it will be truth, it will be true and beautiful. He said they hang together in the Christian sense. This is not in the Christian, it is seen through the Christian. We're not true, and we're not good, and we're not beautiful. But when we're living according to Christ's rule, this comes through us, it's not in us. Jacques Ellul says, material instantiations, that is, manifestations of beauty and goodness, prepare the way for the propositional truth because they appeal to our inner desire. We're not drawn to the ugly. Now, if we are terribly disordered. You can usually tell when a culture has pretty much bottomed out. It's when it is attracted to the lie, to the ugly, and to the bad. But normally we're not. We would prefer to have our neighbor tell the truth. We would rather have our neighbor doing the good. We would rather have our neighbor that has beautiful as part of their life. A Christian culture, instantiate simply means it is a way of expressing it, okay? Truth, goodness, and beauty, which awakens the inner desire directed towards a proper object. Why am I drawn to this? Why am I drawn to things that are beautiful? When I was a child, before I became a Christian, the thing that drew me, that for which I had no answer, but I was drawn to it, the beauty of creation. I would go up behind our house where I lived and up in the hill, and I'd look out over our small valley that was bordered by hills on three sides and a huge lake on the west. And I would go up on a summer day, smell the pine, and look out at this beautiful lake and think, where did this come from? This is so beautiful. Now, others may have been drawn to other things, whether it be music or art or whatever, but I was drawn to that. I wasn't drawn to the manure pile that was on our farm, because that's not what I was made for. I tried to tell my father that. He didn't get the point. A proper Christian culture incarnates truth, goodness, and beauty as a total way of life. And I want to unpack that a little bit for us. This includes our art, our politics, our economics, our literature, film, architecture, our liturgy, and our relationships as a whole. I will try to, at least, I won't probably make a case, but I want to awaken your thinking in this direction. That the first thing is that our church ought to have art, politics, and music, etc., that reflect the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now, I would take art, for example. Now, as a philosopher, my wife is the artist, not me. But as a philosopher, I look at the art often as produced by Christians, and I think it's pretty bad. Because they don't understand what they're about. They try to make all their art evangelistic. That's backside too. Make your art that is faithful to Christ and manifests truth, goodness, and beauty, and guess what? It will be evangelistic. When you try to do art, regardless of what it is, now I'm thinking about the arts, if you're trying to do something with it other than what a Bach would have been doing, right? How does Bach sign his music? Yeah, to the glory of God. He wasn't thinking, I hope this is going to be evangelistic enough. So, I would have, when I was a pastor for 30 years, and I had people in my church who ran for federal government, places in federal government. And I observed often that people who wanted to go to Washington, D.C. to make a difference for Christianity, when they got there, they just fell in with the other crowd. They really made no difference at all. And I think I could say that as well as for things like how many people understand economics from a Christian point of view? Film, most of our Christian film is really wanting. Okay, what can I say? It's wanting in content and it's wanting in quality of presentation. I'm really being pretty critical, so you'll have to forgive me. And if you think differently, our architecture, how many churches, now maybe you don't do this, but in America we build our churches, some places you can't, but how many people who build a church think about what does the architecture of that church say? We give it no thought whatsoever. And yet, before the digital age, architecture was the strongest art form we knew about. It influenced more than any other of the other arts, which is rather interesting. I was at a conference in a town. I'll just let it go. It was a post-Soviet country. And I was at this conference, and I was one of 7 Westerners. This was back in 1995. And we had this conference in which there were everybody, I mean, they were unbelievers, but they were all high-level people. They were economists, they were politicians, and the Orthodox Church was there. But those of us who were Christian spoke on the issues from a Christian worldview. Now somebody, after we left, wrote an article in an art magazine and said, how strange indeed that a building whose architecture was intentionally designed to promote atheism housed a conference where there were Christians speaking. Now how many Christians would ever think about architecture in that way? But he was precisely right on that matter. Our music, I think too many times we spend way too much time imitating the world rather than being leaders in the world in the world of literature. What does our literature look like? Now, I would say I'm not first thinking about the literature that we write for out there or the films that we do for evangelism. I first want to think about what does our Christian culture look like? What does our art look like for the church? Now you say, well, we shouldn't have art in the church, that's too expensive. Well, I don't just think about paintings, think about things that are less expensive, flowers or whatever. Do we have politics in the church? I mean in a good sense. I know there are politics in the church, all right. But do we have politics in the church? Of course we do. We have a way, do we not have a way of governing our church? Well, that's politics. Do we give thought to how we govern the church? I mean, as a group of people, somebody's got to be, the traffic cop, directing things, and we build what our vision is, etc. Do we give thought about that? Music, of course, we have our music in our churches. Have we thought about what is our music doing? We can think about economics. How we spend our money in the church is almost appalling in many places. So if the world looks at us and says, they look at our art, they look at our music, they look at the way our economics, what do they think when they see that? Do they see a culture that is shaped by Christian thinking alone? Or we can look at literature. I'm not thinking about novels or things like that you would write that would be published and for the world, it would be evangelistic. What I'm thinking of is, what does our Sunday school material look like? It's really a question we need to ask. How do we form us? Do we understand anything about pedagogy? Do we understand anything about the importance of teaching in theology, etc.? Film, I've already mentioned, architecture, literature. Well, this is what we first build in our church. This is not first about evangelism. It's about viewing all of life as it was intended to be. It is evangelistic as it draws men to the truth. So that if people would observe our church, if people would come into our church and they would see a Christian culture there, it would be something that would be attractive to them. What does the world want right now? I'll tell you. One of the things they want to do is to escape the noise. But they don't escape the noise often when they come to our church. They're looking for a space to think, to meditate. But do they find that when they come? This creates what I would call an effective human interest in truth because of the goodness and beauty to those in the world. Man is made for this. It is sin that has drawn us away. But if we're Christian, yes, and we've been born again, and we've been renewing our minds, we think differently about these things. It is what is missing in the profane culture, which is contrary to humanity. What we want to do is to build a culture within the church that reflects truth, goodness, and beauty, because I would say that is what is effective. With the A. This is what draws people. This is what drew the people in the Roman world to Christianity. But what is missing in the profane culture ought to be seen in the Christian culture. A true Christian culture develops not by technique, but by the work of the Holy Spirit in and through those who are submitted to the Word of God as living in a total way of life. That's how we do this. We think about everything we do from a Christian point of view. Everything. I can think of so many areas. I'll take one that's somewhat maybe over here. Students who come to university, Christian students, well, I'll even put it even clearer, Christian students who come to a seminary to study. You would not believe their attitude. They cheat. They lie. I don't mean everybody, but where did we get the idea that that's all right? And if in fact I signed and I said I'm committed, this is what I will do, and then think I don't have to do it. Where's the integrity of the Christian life? We desperately need to see this sort of thing demonstrated. The church needs a full cultural expression of the truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, I think probably some of you are saying, this sounds like building a ghetto. This seems like retreating. This seems to you like, oh, we're just over here doing our thing. No. Rod Dreher, who recently wrote the book, The Benedict Option, has one statement, rather almost his thesis of his book. We can't give the world what we don't have ourselves. How do we think we can impact the secular culture if we don't have a Christian culture in the church. That's not to retreat. It's simply as we go about living as Christians and we live in community, then we are to be sensitive as to how we develop our Christian culture. Rod Dreher says, the sad truth is, when the world sees us, it often fails to see anything different from non-believers. Christians often talk about reaching the culture without realizing that having no distinct Christian culture of their own, they have been co-opted by the secular culture they wish to evangelize. Without a substantial Christian culture, it's no wonder that our children are forgetting what it means to be a Christian, and no surprise that we are not bringing in new converts. There's nothing that's attractive. And what do you ever think about? And maybe it's not true in your country, but at least in the States. We are losing a lot of our young people who grow up in the church. And once they get to go off to the university, you may never see them again. Now, do I think that this sort of thing would put it all in right? No. I wouldn't even argue that we ought to do it so we can put it right. What I would argue is we should do this because we're Christians. Don't tack any pragmatics to it. This is just what our Lord calls us to do. We cannot attract a decaying culture with no culture of our own. What does truth look like? Well, where would you find it? You'd find it in the church, or you should. And how are you going to see it? Well, you're going to see it in our artifacts in the church. Now, there are some churches who are doing a really good job of this. When they build a church, they're very conscious of this. A Christian culture is not created by taking what the world is doing and bringing it into the church and giving it a Christian twist. That's not very creative at all right? And by the way, the world sees right through it. They see what you're doing. You say, oh, come, look, we're doing what you're doing. I don't see that's a very wise thing to say. No, we're doing something different. Not because we want to be different, we are different. And we must show that. See, there's a false notion, I think, that we attract the world by offering the world some of the things they're doing. But if that's true, if that's all we are as Christian, as a Christian community, then I'm not sure if we're doing the right thing. In fact, I could make it more poignant. Andy Crouch points out, the rise of interest in cultural transformation has been accompanied by a rise in cultural transformation of a different sort. The transformation of the church into culture's image. I could talk about images, symbols rather. Maybe I should not ask this question, but you know I'm going to. Just do it, yeah. Is there a sense of the sacred space when you go to church? Somebody asked me the other day, where are you worshiping? Because we just moved. And I said, well, I go to church here. And they laughed and they said, oh, I see I tell you what you're saying. Because many times when I go into churches, I don't sense that there's anything. When I mean sacred, I mean it's set apart. I know we are the church as individuals, but we set apart a building, a meeting place, I don't care, but a meeting place, and we think that we're doing something special there, do we not? That there's something really unique going on when the church comes together. We're feeding on the Word of God. When we think about the Lord's table, the Eucharist, or whatever you call it, what sense of awe do we have? I go to a Baptist church. Oh, we don't want to give any sense that we believe that people are saved by taking. Well, okay, fine, I agree with that. But where is the sense that something special there is? Do you think that there is some mystery element in partaking of the Lord's table? I'm told that when C.S. Lewis went to church and they had the Eucharist, they said it was like he was in another world. I remember a young man who had come to Christ. He lived in another country, post-Christian, a post-Soviet country. And he came to Christ. I met him. And I got an email from him one day. And he said, I have been asked to give the Lord's table message, just a brief message. He said, please pray for me. I'm trying to prepare myself. I'm going to have to do this in 6 months. How many of us think we should prepare our hearts? But you read the Puritans. They often went through this process. Many of them would write poetry as a way of kind of self-examination. Is that too far? Well, you can draw your own conclusions. But I often think sometimes that the only difference between the taking up the offering and the Lord's table is at the Lord's table you take something out of the plate, and at the offering you put something in the plate. It's just tacked on the back of a service. I mean, no, that's not true in every case, but I've seen more and more and more of that. The Christian culture includes a distinct Christian ethos. Lance Strait says, participating in a religious ritual places us in a special context that is different from all other contexts. And see, now, maybe it's just because I'm an old man and I'm drawn this way now. But I long for that at times. I'm serious. I long for a place to go to worship. And by the way, when I say worship, I don't mean just singing. Which, say, now we've got the worship out, now we're going to teach the word. The power of naming. So a young man said, I asked him in class one day, what do you do in your church? He said, I'm the worship leader. I said, I don't know what that is. What would you say? Well, tell me, what do you do? And he said, well, I lead the music. I said, so the only time you worship God is when you sing. Well, no. Well, why do you call yourself the worship leader? And he started to think. I think it was a little uncomfortable for him. Whether the location is a church, a synagogue, temple, or mosque, or outdoors at home. See, even he says at home, or in rental halls, because we do have to sometimes use rental halls, right? But what do we do to create the ethos that this is a special place because those who know Christ have come together to worship God in a unique way. We ought to worship God all the time, right? Worship God is what we do. But the fact that we come together for this appointed time, indeed, the deep meaning of sanctification and consecration, traced back to the Hebrew word kadosh. It is to set apart and differentiate ourselves. And we do differentiate ourselves. And you see, if you go to some countries and you go to a Protestant church, you are distinguishing yourself. I mean, there's a risk involved in doing that. But we are so comfortable in the West because we've had the privilege of living in a culture that has, up to this time, has generally been quite... what time we quit?
You have 15 more minutes.
Oh, I'm going to quit then. Well, I'm not. I'm going to do this. This is my vision. You have the parent culture, and you have the Christian culture, the subculture. I don't mean sub, it's less than, it's the Christian culture. And our job is to create a Christian culture in our churches as a witness to the world, but then you see we go out from here and we go into the world and we've learned how to do things in the church, and then you're witnessing to somebody and say, listen, why don't you come? You witness to them and they'll say, well, what is this? And I say, why don't you come to my church to see, not just to hear, but to see what a redeemed community looks like, a redeemed community meeting. So I think this is sort of like the model that I would like to see.